In this video, we're going to be going over enzyme inhibitors, which we are going to see there are two basic types. We have competitive inhibitors and non-competitive inhibitors. Well, enzymes, remember, catalyze all the chemical reactions within the human body. Interfering with their activity can have both positive and negative effects we're going to see. Well, there's two basic types of inhibitors. We have competitive inhibitors and non-competitive inhibitors, which are also called allosteric inhibitors. Competitive inhibitors get their name because the inhibitor is competing for the active site on an enzyme that the substrate is trying to bind to. When the competitive inhibitor gets into that active site, as shown here, it prevents the substrate from binding to the active site and being metabolized over to its product. So it's competing for the same active site. So we call them competitive inhibitors. And once they're there, the substrate can't bind in and it doesn't get converted over to its product. Non-competitive inhibitors can care less about competing for this active site. What they do is they bind to a spot on the enzyme other than the active site, but when they bind, as shown here, it changes the shape of the active site. So the active site can't bind to the substrate, and it prevents the substrate from being converted over to product. So it's inhibiting the enzymatic reaction, but it's doing so by binding in a location other than the active site. So it's not competing. So we call them non-competitive inhibitors, also called allosteric inhibitors. Let's test our knowledge. Pause your video and answer the following questions. Here are the answers. Examples of enzyme inhibitors: malathion. Malathion is an insecticide. It inhibits enzyme activity required for normal functioning of insect nervous system, thereby killing the insect. In fact, a lot of different pesticides are just going to have inhibitors for enzymatic reactions that are specific to the insects that they're killing. Cyanide is another one. Cyanide binds to an enzyme in the electron transport chain and prevents ATP synthesis, which, as you remember, the mitochondria are the chief producers of ATP in aerobic respiration. And if you don't have enough ATP, you're going to die. And that's how cyanide kills. We'll talk more about this when we get to cellular respiration. We're also going to see we have inhibitors that can serve as an antidote for antifreeze poisoning. Now, antifreeze poisoning affects humans, and it also affects animals. We're going to see we have dogs and cats that drink antifreeze and then can die from this, or have organ failure from this. But there's an antidote for it. Common antidote: ethanol, found in various alcoholic drinks, can act as an antidote for antifreeze poisoning. We're going to take a look at why. So we look at antifreeze poisoning. The main ingredients in antifreeze that are poisonous are ethylene glycol and methanol. And ethylene glycol has a sweet taste that can attract children and pets to drink it. When they drink it, the ethylene glycol and methanol is actually relatively non-toxic, but it listed as being the poisonous ingredients. Why? Because the problem is that the body can metabolize them into highly toxic byproducts like formic acid and oxalic acid. These substances can cause severe organ damage, including kidney failure, blindness, metabolic acidosis, may cause death. As shown here, we have our liver, and the liver, when you take in ethylene glycol, the ethylene glycol can be metabolized by an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase that we find here in the liver. And the byproducts of this, mainly oxalic acid, oxalic acid combined with calcium to form calcium oxalate crystals, which can completely shut down kidneys, destroy kidneys, and other organs. Well, what about methanol? Methanol also can be metabolized by the liver by the same enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase, and the byproducts from this get you formaldehyde and then eventually formic acid. And formic acid can cause metabolic acidosis. Formic acid can also damage the retina and optic nerve and cause blindness. So extremely dangerous, these byproducts of antifreeze poisoning. You can use ethanol to treat antifreeze poisoning. And shown here is a diagram with alcohol dehydrogenase acting as the enzyme that's going to metabolize ethanol, methanol, and ethylene glycol. And then these are the byproducts of this. Well, based on what you know from enzyme inhibitors, competitive and non-competitive inhibitors, taking a look at this diagram, how do you think that ethanol works in the body in the treatment of antifreeze poisoning? And you want to focus on alcohol dehydrogenase. And remember, it's the breakdown products of methanol and ethylene glycol that are so deadly. So pause the video, take a look at this diagram, and think about how ethanol is inhibiting the metabolism of methanol and ethylene glycol. Okay, now that you've had some time to think about it, let's go over this and see if your hypothesis on how it works is correct. Ethanol works as a competitive inhibitor. Basically, ethanol is going to outcompete methanol and ethylene glycol for alcohol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that's going to metabolize all three of these. So if you give the person more ethanol, or the animal by IV more ethanol, then the alcohol dehydrogenase will work on the ethanol because there's more of it, and not methanol and ethylene glycol. Well, wait a minute. Well, if you have methanol and ethylene glycol, eventually won't they get metabolized? Yes, they could. But what happens in the body is that methanol and ethylene glycol can go through the kidneys, which remember, these are relatively non-toxic. They'll go through the kidneys and be eliminated by the urine. You're just giving more time for it to be eliminated by the urine by providing more ethanol to tie up the alcohol dehydrogenase, because it's the byproducts, the formic acid, the oxalic acid, that's so deadly to the body. So we just give ethanol. It acts as a competitive inhibitor. It allows more time for the kidneys to eliminate the toxins, preventing their damaging effects. Now, you can also provide sodium bicarbonate by IV in order to treat the acidosis. And while ethanol is great, and ethanol is good for, treating certainly animals with an IV, but you got to watch out because the animals are going to get drunk by doing this. And you can also use this to treat humans, but that's not the primary antidote for this. We have a substance called famotidine, and famotidine works the same as ethanol, but it's about 200 times more effective at binding with alcohol dehydrogenase. So that's your primary antidote. But if you don't have any famotidine, ethanol can work in helping to prevent antifreeze toxicity. Test your knowledge. Pause the video and fill in the following blanks with the correct term. Here are the answers. Test your knowledge part 2. Pause your video and fill in the following blanks with the correct answers. Here are the answers. This concludes the video, and please let me know if you have any questions.